The sound was wrong. A sharp, metallic chatter that did not belong to the snap of a twig or the call of a jay. It sliced through the cold, thin air of the canyon. An alarm raised against the silence he had so carefully built over 2 seasons. Steel on steel. The bell at the gorge entrance. James' white horse moved without thought, a fluid shadow detaching itself from the rock face where he had been cleaning a rifle. His body knew this sequence. The soft scrape of his moccasins on granite, the way he kept to the deep shadows cast by the golden-leafed aspens, the weight of the knife at his belt and the rifle now cradled in his arm. The canyon was his fortress, its narrow entrance a gate he alone controlled. Every tripwire, every deadfall, every snare was a sentence in a language of his own making, a story that said, "Keep out." He heard the rustling before he saw the source, a frantic, muffled struggle in the choke cherry bushes that guarded the game trail. He expected a deer, maybe a young black bear foolish enough to wander this deep. He did not expect the flash of dark blue wool or the glint of a polished leather shoe. She was tangled in the undergrowth like a fallen bird, one of her high-button shoes off, the other suspended a few inches from the ground, her ankle caught cleanly in a braided leather snare he had set for 4-legged predators. Not 2. She was a creature of another world. Her dress, though torn and stained with dirt, was made of fine material, and a matching traveling coat was buttoned tight against the autumn chill. A small, fashionable hat lay crushed beside her. She had stopped struggling when she heard him. Her breath came in quiet, controlled puffs of white, her eyes fixed on him as he approached. There was fear there. Yes, the kind any creature feels when it is trapped, but beneath it, something else, something hard as agate. He stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable, a mask of sun-darkened skin and stoic patience. He took in the details, the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat, the way her gloved hands were clenched into fists, the faint scent of lavender and city dust that clung to her. She did not scream. She did not plead. She simply watched him, waiting. He was used to the silence of the high country, but this was a different kind. A silence stretched taut between them, vibrating with unspoken questions. He thought of what old Boone, the trapper who sometimes left jerky and salt at a drop point miles away, might say. Boone spoke of a ghost in these mountains, a shadow that left no tracks. James cultivated that legend. Ghosts were left alone. This woman had not left him alone. He knelt, the knife seeming to appear in his hand, its blade catching the pale afternoon light. She flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement, but her eyes never left his. He ignored her. His attention focused on the knot. The snare was designed to hold, not to maim. With one clean slice, the leather fell away. She stumbled as her foot touched the ground, a sharp intake of breath signaling pain. She caught herself against the rough bark of a pine, leaning heavily. He did not offer a hand. He rose, sheathing the blade in a single, fluid motion. He had not spoken a word in weeks, and his voice, when it finally came, was rough, like stones grinding together. "There are laws here." Her gaze was unwavering, a startling shade of green, like moss in a deep forest. She nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of her chin. "You will be silent," he said, the words precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You will touch nothing that is mine, and you will not run." Running would be pointless. He knew every rock and crevice of this canyon. She would be caught again within minutes, and he would not be so patient a second time. He turned and began walking back the way he had come, not looking to see if she followed. He heard the hesitant shuffle of her good foot, the drag of the other. The sounds were an intrusion, an offense to the quiet rhythm of his life, a life he had chosen because it was empty of other people. People brought loss. He had had enough of that to fill 10 lifetimes. His Comanche mother, gone to the coughing sickness. His white father, a good man, gone to a bullet from men who saw only his wife's skin. The small sister he could not protect. This place, this solitude, was not a choice. It was a necessity. His camp was a simple affair, a lean-to built against an overhang of rock, a fire pit circled with stones, a stack of firewood cut and split with an almost religious neatness. Everything had its place. Everything was necessary. Anything that was not necessary was a weakness. The woman was a weakness. She limped to the edge of the fire pit and sank to the ground, her face pale with exhaustion and pain. She unwrapped the woolen scarf from her neck and began, with clumsy, shaking fingers, to wrap it around her swelling ankle. He watched her for a moment from the corner of his eye as he stirred the embers of his morning fire, adding a few pieces of dry pine. He had a small pot of cornmeal mush simmering, his evening meal. It was not enough for two. He went to his supply cache, a small cave concealed by a curtain of cured hides, and returned with a strip of dried venison and a tin cup. He filled the cup from the icy stream that ran through the canyon and set both items on the ground near her. Not too close. She looked at the food, then at him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. He grunted in response, the sound more animal than human. Silence was the first law. She had already broken it. He turned his back on her, busying himself with his rifle, methodically wiping down the barrel, checking the action. He could feel her eyes on him, studying him. He was used to being watched, but usually by eyes that held hate or fear or a cold curiosity. Her gaze felt different. It was analytical, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. The sun dipped below the canyon rim, plunging them into a deep, cold shadow. The temperature dropped swiftly. The fire was the only point of warmth and light in the growing dark. He saw her shiver, her fine wool coat no match for the biting air of a high country night. He had one buffalo robe, thick and heavy. He slept in it, wrapped tight against the frost. He had a spare blanket, a rough army-issue thing. He tossed it in her direction without a word. She caught it, murmuring another quiet thanks that he pointedly ignored. She wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind through the pines. He ate his mush. She nibbled at the tough jerky, eating slowly, deliberately, as if conserving her strength. He had decided what to do. At first light, he would take her to the edge of his territory, point her in the direction of the nearest settlement, a mining camp 2 days' walk south, and leave her. It was the simplest solution. Get her out of his world, out of his life. But as she shifted to find a more comfortable position, a small leather satchel she had been clutching slid from her lap and fell open. The firelight caught the contents, a folded piece of oilskin map, its sharp creases worn with handling, and, beside it, a letter. The elegant, forceful script on the envelope bore a name he recognized, a name that carried the weight of steel rails and broken treaties and the kind of power that crushed men without ever seeing their faces. Howard Gaines. He froze, his hand halfway to his mouth. The world she came from, the world of power and money and influence, had just found its way into his sanctuary. He looked at her, truly looked at her then. She was not some foolhardy traveler who had wandered off a trail. Lost women cried for help. Lost women were panicked and desperate. This woman was watchful and quiet. This woman had followed his smoke. He was sure of it now. He was obsessively careful about his fires, keeping them small, using dry wood to minimize the smoke. But a keen eye could spot the haze from a mile away if they knew what to look for. She had known, and she carried maps and trouble from a man like Howard Gaines. She saw him looking and quickly snatched the satchel closed, her cheeks flushing. The movement was sharp, protective. It confirmed his suspicion. The letter was important and dangerous. "Who are you?" he asked, the question abrupt. "Evelyn Ashmore." The answer was immediate, her chin lifting with a hint of defiance. "What do you want here?" "I needed a guide." She said, "I was told a man lived in these mountains, a man who knew the high passes and kept to himself." "Who told you that?" His voice was low, dangerous. "A trapper in Leadville, an old man named Boone." James cursed inwardly. Boone! The man's tongue was too loose. He had probably described James as half-man, half-spirit, a dangerous ghost who could get a person through any terrain. "And Gaines?" he asked, his eyes boring into her. "What has a woman like you to do with a man like that?" Her face hardened, the soft lines tightening into a mask of cold resolve. "He is my guardian, my patron. He provided for my welfare after my parents passed." James almost laughed. He had seen the work of such patrons before. Young women, pretty and alone, taken under the wing of a rich man. It was a gilded cage, nothing more, and women who fled such cages often had bounty hunters sent after them. Not for the law, but for the pride of the man they had embarrassed. "You are running," he stated. It was not a question. "I am escaping," she corrected him, her voice trembling slightly with a sudden fire. "There is a difference. I have a letter, evidence of his son's crimes, things Mr. Gaines would pay a great deal to keep quiet. I was taking it to a United States Marshal in Denver, but his men were watching the coach station. I had to find another way, a way through the mountains." Suddenly, his simple plan to leave her on a trail felt foolish, naive. If Gaines's men were looking for her, they would be thorough. Sending her away would be sending her directly to them. And when they found her, they would ask questions. They would learn about the man in the canyon who helped her. Her trail would lead them straight back to him. His fortress would be breached. He was caught in her snare as surely as she had been caught in his. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. For 2 years, he had lived by a simple code: survive and be left alone. This woman, Evelyn Ashmore, had shattered that code. Keeping her was a danger. Her powerful enemy could bring a private army down on this canyon, but letting her go was also a danger, a more immediate one that would lead those hunters straight to his door. He was trapped between 2 impossible choices. He looked at the vast, star-filled sky, a cold, indifferent witness to his dilemma. The world was full of predators, and he had spent his life learning to be the most patient, the most careful of them all. He had to think like one now. Keeping her here was a controlled risk, a risk he could watch, a risk he could manage, at least for a time. He rose and banked the fire for the night, the movements economical, decisive. He had made a choice, however temporary. He turned to face her, his expression grim in the flickering firelight. 7 days. She looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "You can stay 7 days," he clarified, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I will find out if anyone is following you. We will watch the passes. If the way is clear after 7 days, I will take you to the far side of the valley. From there, you are on your own." A flicker of hope, of profound relief, softened her features. She nodded, her lips pressed together as if to hold back a torrent of words. She understood. He was not offering sanctuary. He was offering a truce, a fragile 7-day truce in a war she had brought to his doorstep. He retreated to the far side of the lean-to and rolled himself in the heavy buffalo robe, his rifle beside him. He did not close his eyes for a long time. He listened to the sound of her breathing, a quiet, rhythmic presence that was as loud as a scream in the solitude he had so fiercely guarded. The bell had rung, the gate had been opened, and now something new and unpredictable was inside his walls. He did not know if it was a poison or a prayer, but he knew with a chilling certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The first day passed in a silence as deep and cold as the canyon floor. Evelyn Ashmore was a quick study. She observed the laws he had set with a quiet diligence that surprised him. She did not speak unless he spoke first, which he did not. She did not wander from the small circle of the camp. She touched only the things he gave her: the blanket, the cup, the food. She moved with a purpose that belied her torn dress and bruised ankle, a woman accustomed to navigating rules, even unspoken ones. On the morning of the second day, she demonstrated a small rebellion of usefulness. While he was checking a line of snares higher up the gorge, she took it upon herself to tend the fire. He returned to find it burning cleanly, a neat stack of kindling beside it, gathered from the dry undergrowth of the pines. She had used his axe, which was leaning against the wood pile, a technical violation of the second law. He paused, his eyes narrowing, but he said nothing. The fire was better than he had left it. Later, she took his tin cup and plate to the stream, scrubbing them with sand until they shone. She was making herself a part of the camp's rhythm, a small, persistent gear fitting itself into his solitary machine. He watched her attempt to cook. He had given her a small portion of cornmeal, and she mixed it with water in her cup, trying to warm it on a hot stone at the edge of the fire. The result was a lumpy, half-cooked paste. She ate it without complaint. Her resilience was a strange and unsettling thing. It was not the brittle strength of a cornered animal, but the deep, patient endurance of an old tree. He found himself thinking about her past, not as a story, but as a series of pressures that had formed her. Her city shoes were a ruin. The fine leather was scraped raw, the sole of one was flapping loose, and they offered no protection from the sharp rocks and biting cold. He saw her wince with every step. It was an inefficiency, a weakness in his camp that grated on him. A lame person was a liability. It was this practical thought, he told himself, that made him do it, not pity, not kindness. He took a hide from his cache, a soft, brain-tanned deerskin he had been saving. He gestured for her to sit on a log. With a charcoal stick, he traced the outline of her good foot onto a piece of birch bark. She watched, her expression unreadable. As he worked, he cut the patterns from the bark, then from the hide, his knife moving with an economy of motion that spoke of 1,000 repetitions. His hands, calloused and scarred, were surprisingly deft. He used a sharpened bone awl to punch the holes for the sinew thread, his movements precise and rhythmic. For 2 days, in the quiet hours after his hunting and trapping rounds, he sat by the fire and stitched. It was slow work, demanding and meditative, and as he worked, she watched. Her silence was not empty, it was attentive. She watched the way he held the leather, the way he pulled each stitch tight with a small, sharp tug. She was learning not just the craft, but the man performing it. In his moments of privacy, when she was down by the stream or resting, he would take a small piece of cottonwood from his pouch and carve. It was a habit from his boyhood, a way to make his hands busy and his mind still. He carved small figures, animals mostly, a hawk with its wings outstretched, a coiled snake, a patient bear. They were simple, but they held life. Sometimes, he carved other things. A horse, like the one his father had given him. A woman with a long braid, her face indistinct but her posture proud, like his mother. He kept these carvings in a leather bag. When a memory grew too sharp, too painful to hold, he would take the corresponding figure and place it in the fire, watching until it was nothing but glowing ash. It was a ritual of control, a way to burn the past before it consumed him. He did not know that she saw him do this from a distance one evening, her green eyes filled with a new, somber understanding. On the 3rd day, he went to check a new set of traps near the stream that fed the canyon. The ground was soft there, a mixture of sand and dark earth. He found what he was looking for, the delicate print of a mink, but beside it, partially overlapping it, was another track. It was a boot print, large and heavy, with a worn heel. It was not his, and it was fresh. A cold dread settled in his stomach. Someone had been here. Not a lost miner, not a wandering trapper. This print was deliberate, placed carefully in the soft ground by someone trying to move quietly. Someone who was hunting. He circled back to the camp, moving like a ghost through the trees. His senses were on fire, every snapped twig, every bird call a potential threat. He found Evelyn gathering firewood, her movements slow but steady, her ankles still swollen but improving. He said nothing of the footprint. Fear was a contagion, and he needed her calm. But his own internal quiet was shattered. The 7-day truce was no longer a simple waiting game. It was a countdown. The shadow of Howard Gaines and his hired men was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical presence at the edge of his world. His solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. He was one man, and they were coming. His internal conflict deepened, the instinct to survive, the one that screamed at him to push her away, to send her out and save himself, was at war with a new, unwelcome feeling, a feeling of responsibility. He had cut her from his snare. He had fed her. He had taken the shape of her foot and was building her a new skin to walk in. These small actions had bound him to her in ways he had not intended. He was no longer just a ghost in the mountains. He was James Whitehorse, and she was Evelyn Ashmore, and they were in this place together. That evening, he finished the moccasins. They were simple, unadorned, but the stitching was perfect and the leather was soft. He held them out to her. She looked from the moccasins to his face, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear or resolve in her eyes. It was a deep, quiet gratitude that asked for nothing. She took them from his hands, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. She slipped them on. They fit perfectly. She stood and took a few tentative steps, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It changed the landscape of her face, softened the hard lines of worry and exhaustion. "A good fit?" she said, breaking the silence. A law broken again, but he did not care. He merely grunted, turning back to the fire to hide the strange warmth that spread through his chest. It was a practical gift, he told himself again, a necessity. That night, the wind changed. It came down from the high peaks, a blade of pure cold that cut through the canyon and stripped the last of the golden leaves from the aspens. The fire, no matter how high he built it, seemed to provide little warmth. He watched Evelyn shiver, her body wrapped in the thin army blanket, her teeth chattering. The temperature was dropping fast. A frost that cold could be dangerous. He looked at his buffalo robe, his one true shelter against the night. It was large enough. He hesitated for only a moment. Survival was the highest law, and it overrode all others. "Come here," he commanded, his voice rough. She looked at him. Startled, he did not elaborate. He simply held open a side of the great robe. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a flicker of uncertainty, then trust. She moved to the fireside of the log where he sat and settled next to him, her back to the flames. He draped the heavy, fur-lined hide over her, then pulled his own side around him, creating a small tent of warmth that trapped their combined body heat. They sat without touching, separated by a few inches of air, but he was acutely aware of her presence, the faint scent of her hair, the soft sound of her breathing, the simple fact of another living, breathing person so close to him. It had been years. The cold outside was immense, but inside the shelter of the robe, a fragile warmth grew. It was more than just the heat from their bodies. It was the shared, silent acknowledgement of their mutual vulnerability. They were two people against the vast, indifferent cold of the wilderness. And for this one night, they were not alone. He stared into the darkness, his hand resting on the rifle across his lap. He felt the tension in her body slowly ease as the warmth seeped into her bones. Her shivering subsided. He thought she had fallen asleep, but then she spoke, her voice a near whisper, barely audible above the wind. "My father was a watchmaker. He had hands like yours, strong but careful." He did not reply. He did not know how. He just sat there, listening to the wind howl, feeling the unfamiliar weight of another person's trust settling upon him. He was a man who carved his memories into wood so he could burn them. But he had a feeling this night, this shared warmth in the face of the biting wind, was a memory he would not be able to carve away. He must have drifted off, lulled by the fire and the unexpected peace. What woke him was a sound. It was faint, carried on a gust of wind from far down the canyon. It was the sharp, metallic chatter of steel on steel. A bell. Not the one at the entrance, but a smaller one. A warning bell on a secondary trail. A trail only a man who was tracking, not traveling, would use. His body went rigid. Her head, which had slumped in sleep, came up with a start. She had heard it too. The truce was over. The hunt had begun. The silence that followed the chime of the distant bell was heavier than the one that had preceded it. It was a silence that listened. James did not move for a full minute, his body a statue of perfect stillness, his senses reaching out into the canyon, tasting the air, sifting the sounds. The wind was shifting, coming in colder gusts, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and wet, the smell of a coming storm. The sky, visible as a narrow ribbon of deepening gray between the canyon walls, confirmed it. The human threat was still out there, but a more ancient and impartial one was rolling in to claim the day. He turned to Evelyn, his face grim. "The storm will be here in an hour. We make ready." His words were not a request. He moved with an urgency that pulled her into its current. He pointed to the lean-to. "Take everything inside, food, tools, saddlebags, anything that can be ruined by water." He began unlashing the ropes that held the main buffalo hide covering the shelter's roof, preparing to add another layer. She did not question him. She moved quickly, her limp less pronounced in the moccasins he had made her. She gathered the few tools, the tin plates and the small sacks of cornmeal and salt, piling them in the driest corner of the shallow shelter. He worked above her, pulling a second, heavy elk hide over the first, the oiled leather stiff in the cold. The wind was a physical thing now, tearing at the hide, trying to rip it from his grasp. "Rocks," he called down, his voice sharp against the rising howl of the wind. Heavy ones. She understood immediately. She began hauling stones from the fire pit and the stream bank, her arms straining with the effort, her breath coming in ragged puffs. She would place a rock on the edge of the shelter floor, and he would reach down, his fingers strong and sure, and pull it up to weigh down the flapping edges of the hides. They worked in a rhythm born of necessity, a silent, desperate partnership against the sky. He jumped down as the first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall. They struck the dust with small, dark explosions. He grabbed his short-handled shovel and began to dig, his movements powerful and efficient, carving a shallow trench around the high side of the lean-to, a channel to divert the inevitable flood of water that would soon pour down the rock face. Mud splattered his leggings, his face. Evelyn watched for a moment, then picked up a flat piece of shale and began to scrape at the earth, widening the channel he was creating. Her hands, once gloved and soft, becoming caked with dark, wet soil. The rain came then in a solid sheet, a gray wall of water that blurred the world. The temperature plummeted. The rain turned to ice, small pellets of sleet that rattled against the hides and stung their exposed skin. And then came the hail. It started as the size of peas, then marbles, then acorns, hammering down with a deafening roar. It was a bombardment, a full assault from the heavens. "Inside!" James yelled over the din, pushing her deeper into the shelter. They huddled together in the back, the world outside reduced to a chaotic roar and the percussive violence of ice against leather. A brilliant flash of lightning lit the canyon in a stark, momentary photograph of white rock and black, churning sky, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The ground vibrated beneath them. Evelyn cried out, an involuntary sound of pure terror, and pressed herself against the rock wall. Her whole body was shaking, not just from the cold, but from a deep, primal fear. He saw the tremor in the dim light, the way her hands were clenched, her knuckles white. She was losing heat fast, the wet clothes, the cold, the fear. It was a dangerous combination. He acted on pure instinct, the same instinct that told him how to survive a blizzard or a rock slide. He moved closer, his shoulder pressing against hers. "Your shaking is making it worse. We have to share heat." He pulled the thick buffalo robe, their blanket from the night before, from the driest part of the shelter, and wrapped it around both of them, pulling her firmly against his side. She resisted for a second, her body stiff with a lifetime of learned mistrust. But the cold was relentless, and the thunder cracked again. And she sagged against him, her fear overriding her pride. He held her steady, his arm around her shoulders, a solid, unmoving anchor in the storm. It was a practical gesture, a simple calculation of survival, but it felt like a profound transgression. He had not held another person like this since he was a boy, trying to comfort his little sister. The memory was a knife twist in his gut. They sat in the roaring darkness, the storm raging around their small pocket of existence. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs, gradually slowing its pace. Her shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering cold. In the enforced intimacy of their shelter, with the world being torn apart outside, the walls he had so carefully built around himself began to crack. "My mother was Numunu," he said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the storm. He did not know why he said it. The words just came. "The people. What you call Comanche. She taught me the names of the mountains in her tongue. My father was a white man, a trader. He taught me to read and to fix rifles." He stared into the darkness, seeing faces he had not allowed himself to see for years. I did not belong to her people. I did not belong to his, so I belong here, to the rocks and the wind. He felt her stir beside him, a small shift in weight. She was quiet for a long time, and he thought she would not reply. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile thread of sound in the tempest. Mr. Gaines called it guardianship. She said, he told everyone he was my benefactor, that he had saved me from a life of poverty after my parents died. He chose my dresses, my books, the people I was allowed to speak to. He said it was for my own protection, to preserve my reputation. But it was a cage, a beautiful, comfortable cage where I was his most prized possession. He would show me off at parties, like a rare bird he had captured. His son. His son believed that what his father owned, he had a right to use. The story hung in the air between them. 2 different kinds of prisons, 2 different kinds of exile. He did not ask for details. He did not need to. He understood the language of ownership, of being seen as something less than a person. He pulled the robe a little tighter around them. It was the only answer he could give. The storm raged for hours, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The hammering of the hail ceased, replaced by the sound of 1,000 waterfalls as the water poured off the canyon walls. A pale, watery light filtered into the shelter. When they emerged, it was to a world remade. The stream was a churning, brown torrent, 5 times its normal size, and it had carved a new channel through the center of their camp. The fire pit was completely submerged, a massive ponderosa pine. Its roots ripped from the saturated ground had fallen across the game trail, its branches a tangled wall. Their small, orderly camp was a ruin of mud and debris. For a moment, they just stood there, surveying the destruction. It felt like a final, crushing defeat. But then James picked up his axe, its handle slick with rain. He walked to the fallen tree and, with a powerful swing, sank the blade deep into the trunk. The clean, sharp sound echoed in the quiet canyon. It was the sound of defiance. Evelyn watched him for a second, then picked up the shovel. She went to the flooded fire pit and began the slow, laborious work of bailing out the muddy water. They worked all day without speaking, their bodies aching, their muscles screaming in protest. He chopped and sawed at the massive tree, clearing a path, his face set in a grim mask of determination. She hauled the smaller branches away. Her dress, already torn, now ripped and stained with mud and pine pitch. Together, they rebuilt the fire pit, lining it with new stones, digging it deeper, raising it higher than before. By late afternoon, the stream had receded, leaving behind a thick layer of silt. The camp was altered, scarred, but it was functional again. James, using the driest tinder from deep within his cave, managed to coax a small flame to life in the new fire pit. The sight of the smoke, thin and white against the bruised evening sky, felt like a miracle, a resurrection. They sat by the new fire, exhausted, sharing a piece of roasted rabbit he had caught in a snare that had survived the storm. A new kind of silence was between them now. It was not the tense, watchful silence of the first days, but a comfortable quiet, the kind shared by people who have labored and survived together. The storm had washed something away, some of the fear, some of the distance. He looked at her across the flames. Her hair was a wild tangle, her face smudged with dirt, her fine dress a tattered rag. He realized he no longer saw a city woman, a piece of trouble. He saw a survivor. He saw Evelyn. As the last light faded from the sky, he stood and looked down the valley. The air was unnaturally clear after the storm, the distant peaks sharp and purple against the horizon. And then he saw it, far to the south, near the valley's end. A thin column of smoke rose into the still air. It was not the diffuse haze of a campfire. It was a deliberate, controlled plume, rising and puffing in a distinct pattern. A signal. The storm in the sky was over. The one on the ground was just beginning. The signal smoke was an argument James had with himself for the rest of the day and through a restless night. It was a clear statement: we are here. We are organized, and we are not leaving. The storm had scattered them, he reasoned, washed away Evelyn's trail. And now they were regrouping, signaling to a partner on another ridge. They would resume the hunt as soon as the ground was dry enough to hold a track. This brief reprieve was not a gift. It was a ticking clock. He moved with a new tension, a coiled energy that made the small space of the camp feel charged. His solitude had been a shield, but now it was a cage. He was one man, and the hunters, however many there were, had the backing of a man whose wealth could buy a small army. He needed information. He needed supplies. And the only currency he possessed was hanging on stretching boards inside his supply cave, the thick winter pelts of beaver, mink, and fox. The best of his trap lines lay 2 miles up the canyon, in a treacherous, rock-strewn pass that was too difficult for deer but perfect for the smaller, more valuable fur-bearers. It was a risk to go there. It would take them away from the relative security of the camp and expose them on higher ground. But staying put was also a risk. A slow, passive waiting for the end. He chose movement. "We will leave at first light," he announced to Evelyn as they ate their meager evening meal. "I need to check the high traps." She simply nodded, her eyes asking the question she would not voice: "Is it safe?" He did not offer reassurance he did not feel. Before the sun crested the eastern ridge, he was awake and preparing. He handed her a small pack containing water and a strip of dried meat. He also gave her his second knife, a smaller skinning blade, showing her how to strap the sheath to her calf beneath the hem of her ruined dress. He then did something that surprised them both. He took his spare pistol, a Colt Peacemaker, from his saddlebag. He checked the action, loaded it, and handed it to her butt first. "Do you know how to use this?" "My father taught me," she said, her voice quiet. "He insisted I learn. He said a woman should know how to protect herself from more than just gossip." She took the weapon, its weight familiar in her hand. Her grip was steady. "Good," he said. "Keep it. Do not use it unless I am down. Only then." The journey to the pass was a lesson in silence and caution. He led the way, his rifle held ready, his moccasined feet making no sound on the damp earth. He moved in a low crouch, using the massive boulders and thick stands of spruce for cover. He taught her 3 hand signals: stop, get down, and move forward. She followed his every step, placing her new moccasins precisely where he had placed his, her body learning the rhythm of stealth. The world was no longer just scenery. It was a collection of sight lines, hiding places, and potential ambush points. They found the tracks an hour into their climb. At first, he saw the faint, almost erased impressions of the heavy boot print he had seen before. a ghost on the damp ground. But then he saw the new tracks, fresh since the storm. They were large, padded, with the telltale mark of claws that did not retract. Wolf, a whole pack by the look of it, their trail weaving through the rocks, following the same path he and Evelyn were on. A cold knot formed in his gut. Wolves were wary of men. They did not typically hunt so close to a known camp, unless something had made them bold or hungry. He looked at Evelyn. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as she stared at the tracks. The wolves were a physical manifestation of the dread that had haunted them for days, the feeling of being stalked, of being prey. He put a finger to his lips and motioned for her to continue, his own vigilance doubling. The pass was a narrow defile, a wound in the mountain's granite flank. Wind whistled through the rocks, carrying the iron scent of blood. He smelled it before he saw it. One of his traps, a powerful steel jaw trap chained to a spike driven deep into a fissure, had been successful. A large red fox was caught in its grip. Its life already bled out onto the gray stone, but it had not died alone. The area around the trap was a scene of carnage. The snow and mud were churned into a bloody mess, littered with tufts of gray and red fur. The wolves had found the trapped fox and fought over the easy meal. "It is done," he said, his voice low. "We will take the fox and go back." He laid his rifle against a rock and knelt, his hands working to release the powerful springs of the trap. It was a two-handed job, requiring all his strength and focus, and it was in that moment of distraction, his attention fixed on the steel and the chain, that they came. They did not howl, they did not growl, they simply appeared. One moment the rocks were empty, the next they were there, shadows detaching themselves from shadows. 6 of them, lean, gray, and hungry. They fanned out, blocking the entrance to the pass, their yellow eyes glowing with a cold, intelligent light. One stood forward from the rest. He was huge, his fur scarred and dark, a chunk missing from one ear. The alpha. He lowered his head, a low rumble beginning deep in his chest. James rose slowly, his knife now in his hand. His rifle was feet away, an impossible distance. He was caught, exposed. He pushed Evelyn behind him, his body a shield between her and the pack. His mind raced, calculating odds, looking for an escape that did not exist. The wolves began to circle, their movements fluid and coordinated, tightening the net. They were not afraid. They were confident. The alpha took a step forward, then another, its lips peeling back from its teeth. James braced himself, his knuckles white on the handle of his knife. He knew he could take the alpha, maybe one more, but the others would be on him in an instant. It would be a messy, brutal end. He thought of his father, dying in the dirt. He thought of his promise to himself, to die alone, on his own terms. It seemed the world had other plans. He heard a movement behind him, a rustle of wool, the sharp, metallic click of a hammer being pulled back. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Evelyn was standing there, the Colt held in both hands, her arms extended. Her whole body was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shudder, but the gun was pointed directly at the alpha wolf's chest. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "I cannot." "Yes, you can," James said, his own voice low and steady, not looking away from the wolf. "You must breathe. Aim for the center. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." The alpha seemed to sense the new threat. It paused, its head cocked, its yellow eyes fixed on her. It let out a single, sharp bark, a command. 2 of the other wolves began to creep forward from the sides. "Now, Evelyn," he said, his voice calm, cutting through her fear. "Now." The world seemed to explode in a deafening roar of sound and fire. The gun bucked in her hands, the recoil slamming her back a step. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The alpha wolf stood its ground, a look of almost canine surprise on its face. Then, A dark flower of red bloomed on its chest. It staggered, tried to take another step, and then its legs collapsed beneath it. It fell to the ground in a heap and did not move. Silence descended on the pass, a silence more profound than the noise it had replaced. The other wolves froze, their pack discipline shattered by the sudden, violent death of their leader. They looked from their fallen alpha to the two humans, confusion and fear warring in their eyes. That was James's opening. He lunged for his rifle, scooped it from the ground, and fired in a single, fluid motion. He did not aim to kill. He fired into the rock just above the head of the closest wolf. The bullet screamed off the granite, and the wolf yelped, turning and fleeing. That was all it took. The spell was broken. The pack turned as one and vanished back into the rocks, leaving behind only their dead leader and the ringing silence. James stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, the rifle smoking in his hand. He slowly lowered it, his eyes finding Evelyn. She was still standing in the same spot, the pistol hanging limply at her side, her face the color of ash. Her eyes were fixed on the dead wolf, a look of horror and disbelief on her face. Then, she dropped the gun, stumbled to the side, and was sick. He went to her, retrieving the pistol from the ground. He did not touch her, just stood a few feet away, waiting until the retching subsided, when she finally straightened up, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked at him, her eyes hollow. He had expected to feel relief, a grim satisfaction. Instead, he felt a strange, aching tenderness. She had been terrified, but she had stood her ground. She had not run. She had saved him. The thought was so foreign, so contrary to the laws of his world, that it shook him to his core. "I thought I would live alone until I died," he said. The words came out rough, unbidden, as if they had been torn from a place deep inside him. She just stared at him, her breath still coming in ragged gasps. He bent down and pried the spent cartridge from the pistol's cylinder. It was still warm. The brass glinted in the pale light. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. She looked at the small object, then back at his face. A flicker of understanding, of something deep and unspoken, passed between them. She took the casing, her trembling fingers closing around it. It was a decision made, a line crossed. It was the first bullet fired in their shared war, a small piece of brass that sealed their pact. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice regaining its usual firmness. "That signal smoke, this wolf pack, they are closing in. We need money. We need information. We need to get out of these mountains and see the enemy's face." "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Leadville," he said, his eyes already looking south, past the pass, toward the distant, unseen chaos of the mining towns. "We sell the furs. We listen to the talk, and then we decide which way to run." Leadville was not a town. It was a wound in the earth, oozing mud, men, and noise. After the profound silence of the canyon, the assault on the senses was staggering. The air, thick with coal smoke and the metallic tang of the smelters, was a constant barrage of sound, the rhythmic, earth-shaking thunder of the stamp mills, the tinny discord of a dozen saloon pianos playing different tunes, the shouts of mule drivers, and the ceaseless murmur of 1,000 desperate conversations. The streets were channels of thick, brown mire, navigated by a river of men in muddy boots and canvas coats, their faces etched with the twin fevers of greed and exhaustion. James moved through the chaos like a ghost, his body coiled with a tension that was almost painful. Every shout was a potential threat, every alleyway a possible ambush. He was a creature of open spaces and clean lines of sight, and this crowded, stinking labyrinth set his teeth on edge. He kept Evelyn on his sheltered side, his hand never far from the butt of his pistol. She, in turn, walked with her head held high, her gaze straight ahead, a small, determined island in the turbulent human sea. Her tattered dress and his buckskins drew stares, but in a town filled with every kind of outcast and hopeful, they were just one more strange sight. He found the fur trader's office, a cramped, dusty room that smelled of cured hides and chewing tobacco. The trader, a man with small, shrewd eyes, weighed the pelts, his gaze lingering on the flawless fur of the silver fox. He did not ask where they came from. He paid in gold coin, a heavy weight in the small leather pouch James slipped inside his shirt. It was enough for a room, a meal, and a horse, if they were careful. It was as they were leaving the trader's that the world narrowed to a single point. 3 men stepped out of an alley, blocking their path. They were not miners. They were dressed in trail clothes, but their coats were tailored, their boots expensive, and their holsters were tied down low and businesslike. They moved with the lazy confidence of predators who knew they were at the top of the food chain. The one in the lead, a man with a drooping mustache and pale, empty eyes, held a piece of paper in his hand. "Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Miss Evelyn Ashmore, your guardian, Mr. Howard Gaines, is very worried about you. He sent us to escort you home." He held up the paper. It was a handbill, with a finely sketched portrait of Evelyn. The likeness was unnervingly good. Below it, in bold letters, it offered a substantial reward for information leading to the safe return of his beloved ward. It was not a wanted poster for a criminal. It was a property claim. Evelyn went rigid, a small, sharp intake of breath the only sign of her fear. James stepped slightly in front of her, his body a silent challenge. His hand now rested on his pistol. The street around them grew quiet, the ever-present murmur of the town fading as people stopped to watch. A confrontation was a form of public entertainment in Leadville. "Now, friend," the man with the mustache said, his eyes flicking to James, "this does not concern you. This is a private family matter. Just step aside, and there will not be any trouble." "This is my concern," James said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. The bounty hunter's smile was thin and unpleasant. He and his 2 companions spread out, their hands hovering near their own weapons. The moment stretched, thin and brittle. A single wrong move, a single panicked twitch, and the muddy street would run with blood. "That is quite enough of that." The voice that cut through the tension was not loud, but it carried the unmistakable weight of authority. An older man, dressed in a respectable but well-worn black suit, stepped out from the crowd. His hair was white. His face was lined with the cares of a difficult world, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He looked at the handbill, then at the bounty hunter, then at James and Evelyn. "I am Judge Morrison," he said, his gaze settling on the man with the mustache, "and I see no sheriff's seal on that paper. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. Therefore, you have no authority to take this woman by force within the bounds of this town." The bounty hunter sneered. "The law is a long way from here. Old man, Mr. Gaines's money is a lot closer." "Perhaps," the judge replied calmly, "but in this territory, even the law has teeth when good men are willing to bear them, and the law is very clear on the matter of guardianship in marriage. A husband's authority supersedes a guardian's. Is this man your husband, Miss Ashmore?" The question hung in the air, a shocking, impossible lifeline. Evelyn stared at the judge, her mind reeling. James did not move, but he felt the world shift on its axis. It was a trap, a solution, a condemnation, all in one. To say no was to surrender Evelyn to these men. To say yes was to bind himself to her fight, to her past, in a way that could never be undone. She looked at him then, her green eyes filled with a desperate plea and a terrifying trust. She was giving him the choice. She was letting him decide their fate. He looked back at the bounty hunter, at the cold certainty in his eyes, the casual cruelty of a man who served money above all else. He thought of the cage Evelyn had described, of the life she had fled. He thought of her standing her ground against the wolves, in the silent canyon of his heart. A decision was made. "He is," James said. The 2 words were the heaviest things he had ever lifted. Judge Morrison nodded, a flicker of something like approval in his eyes. Well then, a simple civil registration will make it official. My office is just down the street. I suggest you see to it. As for you gentlemen, he said, turning back to the bounty hunters, I suggest you find a drink. Your business here is concluded. For now. The bounty hunter stared at James, his eyes full of venom. This is not over, he hissed. He crumpled the handbill in his fist, turned, and disappeared back into the crowd, his men following like vultures. The judge's office was a small room, smelling of old paper and dust. He filled out the certificate with a scratchy pen, his movements methodical. He asked for their names. James Whitehorse, James said, speaking his full name aloud to a stranger for the first time in years. Evelyn Ashmore. The judge paused, his pen hovering over the paper. He looked at Evelyn. And your new name? Madam. A blush rose on her cheeks, but her voice was clear. Evelyn Whitehorse. They signed the document on a rickety wooden desk. The paper felt thin and fragile, a ridiculously flimsy shield against a man like Howard Gaines. But as Judge Morrison signed his own name and stamped it with the official seal of the Colorado Territory, it became something more. It became a line drawn in the sand, a declaration. They found a room to rent above the livery stable. It was small and clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over a muddy alley. The rain from the night before had returned, a slow, steady drumming on the roof that insulated them from the noise of the town. They were alone, together, in a way they had never been before. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the enormity of what they had just done. Evelyn stood by the window, her back to him, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. He stood by the door, a silent guardian, unsure of what law governed this new territory between them. He had faced down wolves and armed men without flinching, yet the quiet of this small room terrified him. She turned to face him, her expression a mixture of fear and a fierce, heartbreaking resolve. She began to unbutton the front of her dress, her fingers clumsy at first, then more certain. She shrugged it off her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. She stood before him in her chemise and corset, the rigid whalebone structure a symbol of the life she had just legally escaped. Her fingers went to the laces at her back, fumbling with the knots. "Allow me," he said, his voice rough. He stepped forward and gently turned her around, his calloused fingers, so adept at skinning knives and trigger pulls, worked carefully at the tight laces. He felt the tension in her shoulders, the tremor that ran through her. One by one, the laces loosened, the rigid cage falling away. Her corset fell open. She took a deep, shuddering breath, a breath that seemed to be the first truly free one she had ever taken. She turned back to face him, her chemise clinging to the lines of her body, her eyes shining in the dim light of the oil lamp. Her face was vulnerable, open and yet impossibly strong. "Dare to tame me?" she asked, her voice a whisper that was both a challenge and a plea. Young Comanche trembled. It was not with the desire to conquer, but with the overwhelming, terrifying weight of her trust. She was not offering her body. She was offering her freedom, her past, her future, into his keeping. It was a gift more precious than any gold, more dangerous than any blade. She saw a man who had offered her protection without demanding ownership, and in that, she found the safety to be truly brave. He did not answer with words. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of profound reverence. He saw not a woman to be tamed, but a spirit to be honored. He drew her into his arms, not with force, but with an invitation. In the small, rain-soaked room, surrounded by the scent of damp leather and the dim glow of the lamp, they did not conquer each other. They found a sanctuary. They whispered promises not of forever, but of this night, of this moment of safety in the heart of the storm. They came together not in a clash of wills, but in a quiet, mutual surrender to a trust that had been forged in silence, fire, and ice. Later, as they lay under the thin blanket, listening to the rain, the reality of their situation returned. They had won a battle, but not the war. Their public act had made them a target. The bounty hunters would not be deterred for long. The law was a shield, but it was a shield that could be broken by enough money and enough bullets. "We leave at sunrise," he whispered into the darkness, his voice firm. She did not ask where. She simply turned and pressed her face against his chest, her hand clutching the small, spent bullet casing she still kept. It did not matter where they went. They were going there together. They left Leadville in the pre-dawn gray, a world of mist and shadow. The town was a sleeping beast, its fires banked, its noises muted to a low grumble. They rode a single horse, a sturdy bay James had purchased with the fur money, its price haggled down with a few terse words and a hard stare. Evelyn rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek resting against the solid warmth of his back. She had a new dress of plain, durable wool and a traveling cloak, practical garments for a hard journey, not a city promenade. Her past life was a pile of torn blue fabric on the floor of a rented room. The journey back to the canyon was the reverse of their journey out. But the landscape of their relationship had been irrevocably altered. There was no longer the silence of a captor and a captive, but the quiet understanding of partners. They spoke little, but every shared glance, every slight shift of weight as they navigated the treacherous trail, was a conversation. He was acutely aware of the light pressure of her hands, the rhythm of her breathing. He was no longer just a guide. He was a husband. The word felt foreign on his tongue, a coat tailored for another man. Yet he was wearing it. He pushed them hard, his eyes constantly scanning the back trail. The bounty hunters were not fools. They would have discovered their departure at sunrise and would be on their trail, sometime in the late afternoon of the second day. As they rested the horse in a thick stand of aspens, he saw it, a flash of light from a high ridge miles to the south. It was not the glint of sun on water or mica. It was the sharp, metallic gleam of sun on a spyglass lens. He said nothing to Evelyn. He simply shortened their rest and altered their course, taking them through a winding, water-carved arroyo that would hide them from view but slow their progress. The enemy was patient, and they were coming. Re-entering the canyon felt like stepping into a memory. The air grew stiller. The sounds of the wider world fell away, replaced by the familiar whisper of the wind through the pines and the murmur of the stream. But it was not the same. When he had lived here alone, the canyon had felt like a fortress, a vast, impenetrable sanctuary. Now, with Evelyn beside him, it felt small, fragile, a trap. It was no longer a place to live, but a place to leave behind. They made their last camp in the familiar lean-to. The fire pit they had rebuilt stood as a small monument to their shared survival. The world felt quiet, poised on the edge of a great change. He knew what he had to do. It was a final piece of business, a severing of an old anchor before they set sail on a new, uncertain sea. After they had eaten, he went to his supply cave. Evelyn watched him, her expression questioning but silent. He emerged a moment later carrying a small leather bag. He sat by the fire and untied the drawstring, emptying its contents onto a flat stone. The carvings lay scattered in the firelight, a silent wooden menagerie. The hawk, its wings spread for flight, the patient, powerful bear, the coiled snake, ready to strike. Each was a piece of his solitude, a friend carved from the heart of the forest. And there were others. A horse, its head high and proud. The memory of a gift from a father he barely remembered. And finally, the last one. A woman with a long braid down her back, her face smooth and featureless. Yet she was unmistakably his mother. The way she stood, her posture straight and dignified, was a memory his hands knew better than his mind. These carvings were his history, his griefs, his companions, They were the silent witnesses to his lonely years. To carry them forward would be to carry the past with him, a weight that would slow them down, a ghost that would haunt their future. A man with a wife and a war to fight had no room for such things. He picked up the hawk. He held it in his palm for a long moment, feeling the smooth, worn wood, the clean lines his knife had made. Then, with a deliberate motion, he tossed it into the heart of the fire. Evelyn made a small sound, a soft gasp of surprise and understanding. She said nothing. She simply watched, her hands clasped in her lap, her face illuminated by the growing flames. The wood of the hawk caught quickly, the delicate wings blackening, curling, then erupting into a brief, bright flame before collapsing into embers. He picked up the bear, then the snake, and sent them to join the hawk, one by one. He committed his wooden family to the fire. Each was a small death, a small act of renunciation. He was clearing the slate, making room. He saved the horse and the woman for last. He held them both in his hands, the two halves of his heritage, the man who gave him his name and the woman who gave him his blood. He remembered his father's quiet kindness, his mother's fierce love. To burn them felt like a betrayal, but to keep them felt like a weakness. He was not that boy anymore. He was not a ghost hiding in the mountains. He was a man who had signed his name to a piece of paper, a man who had taken a wife. He closed his eyes for a second, then tossed them both into the flames. The fire leaped up, consuming them, the heat washing over his face. He watched until they were gone, until nothing remained but glowing ash and the memory of their shapes. A great quiet settled in his soul. The past was not erased, but it was released. He felt strangely light. He turned to Evelyn. The firelight danced in her eyes, reflecting a deep, somber wisdom. She had understood the ceremony. She knew what he had just sacrificed. "My name," he said, his voice clearer, stronger than he had ever heard it. "It is James, James Whitehorse." She nodded slowly, the corners of her mouth turning up in a small, sad smile. "It is a good name, James Whitehorse." He knew then that they had crossed the final bridge. He was no longer the nameless Comanche of her rescue. He was a man with a name, a history he had just laid to rest, and a future he had yet to claim. "This place," he said, gesturing to the canyon around them. "It is finished. Colorado is finished for us. Gaines will not stop. His men are on our trail now. That paper we signed, it was a challenge. He will answer it." "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice steady. There was no fear in it, only a quiet readiness. "North," he said. He had been thinking about it for days, the idea taking shape in his mind. Montana. The territory is vast. A man can disappear there. A man and his wife. We can find a valley, a place with water and good hunting, a place to build. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face, giving her the chance to refuse. It was a hard life he was offering, a life of running and hiding, of starting over with nothing but their own two hands. She did not hesitate. Her gaze was as direct and clear as a winter sky. "I spent years of my life running from something. James, I will not run anymore." She reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his arm. "I am not running from him. I am walking toward you." The simple power of her words struck him with more force than any bullet. He, who had never dared to want anything, who had built his life on the bedrock of having nothing to lose, was now faced with the terrifying prospect of having everything. He stood and went back to the cave, returning with a rolled-up piece of oiled leather. He knelt by the fire and untied it, spreading it open on the ground. It was a map, not a printed one like hers, but one drawn by hand on a cured piece of deerskin. It was creased and worn, marked with his own symbols for water sources, game trails, and mountain passes. It was a map of his world. "Here," he said, his finger tracing a faint line that led from their current position. A small, insignificant dot, northward, across the vast, empty spaces of Wyoming, toward the jagged teeth of the Beartooth Mountains. This is the way. It will be hard. Winter is coming. She leaned over the map, her hair brushing against his shoulder. Her finger came to rest beside his, on the blank, unnamed space that was Montana. "Then we had best get an early start," Evelyn Whitehorse said. They sat there for a long time by the dying fire, their heads bent together over the deerskin map. Two people charting a course into the unknown. The ghosts of the canyon were gone, consumed by the flames. Ahead of them lay a long, cold trail, a powerful enemy, and an uncertain future. But for the first time in his life, James Whitehorse was not walking it alone. The journey north was a long, grinding prayer against the coming winter. They moved through the vast, empty landscapes of Wyoming, a territory of wind and sky, keeping to the broken country. The badlands and foothills where a man and a woman on a single horse were less likely to be seen. They traveled with the sun and the stars, speaking little, conserving their energy, becoming a part of the vast, indifferent wilderness. James taught Evelyn the art of being unseen, of reading the land, of knowing which ridges would silhouette them against the sky. She, in turn, became his second pair of eyes, her gaze constantly scanning their back trail, her city-bred senses now sharpened to the subtle language of a broken twig or a distant dust devil. They crossed into Montana territory as the first snows were dusting the high peaks, a warning that their time was running out. For weeks, they searched, pushing deeper into the mountains, looking for the kind of place that existed more in James's mind than on any map. He was looking for a defensible position with an abundance of resources, a place where they could survive a hard winter and the men who were surely still hunting them. And then they found it. It was a valley tucked between two massive, granite-shouldered mountains, its entrance a narrow, easily guarded pass choked with ancient firs, a clear, cold stream, born from a high glacier, bisected a meadow of rich grass, cured to gold by the autumn frosts. The slopes were thick with the lodgepole pine and aspen, a ready supply of timber and firewood. It was a pocket of life, sheltered from the wind, rich with game, and hidden from the world. It felt like an exhalation, a place where they could finally stop running and breathe. The work began immediately, a frantic, desperate race against the descending cold. Their first shelter was a crude lean-to, but their minds were on something more permanent, a home. They chose a spot on a slight rise overlooking the stream, with the solid rock face of the mountain at its back. James became a force of nature. He felled trees with a relentless, rhythmic swing of his axe, the clean scent of pine filling the air. He showed Evelyn how to limb the fallen trunks, how to peel the bark in long, fragrant strips. His knowledge was a thing of instinct and muscle, passed down not in words but in action. He taught her how to read the grain of the wood, how to notch the logs so they would lock together, solid and true. Evelyn, in turn, found a strength she never knew she possessed. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. She hauled stones from the stream bed for the foundation and the fireplace, her muscles burning with a clean, honest ache. She learned to mix clay, water, and dried grass into a thick daub to chink the gaps between the logs, her fingers becoming architects of warmth and shelter. In their shared labor, a new kind of intimacy grew, a partnership forged in sweat and soil. As they worked, their separate worlds began to merge. He would point out the plants at the edge of the forest, showing her the yarrow that could be used to stop bleeding, the wild onions that added flavor to their stew, the bitter root that, once cooked, was good survival food. He taught her how to weave a simple snare from strands of her own hair, strong and almost invisible, and where to place it on a rabbit run. At night, by the light of the fire in their half-finished cabin, she would repay him in a currency he had long ago abandoned. She had bought a small, cheap primer and a pencil in Leadville. With the patient focus of a watchmaker's daughter, she would guide his hand, showing him how the strange, black squiggles on a page could be coaxed into sounds, then words. He was a clumsy student at first, his hands more comfortable with the heft of an axe than the delicacy of a pencil. But he was persistent. The idea that the thoughts of men long dead could be trapped on paper was a kind of magic he was determined to understand. One morning, Evelyn was sick. She tried to hide it, turning away from him as a wave of nausea racked her body. But he saw the new weariness in her eyes, the faint shadows beneath them. He had seen this kind of sickness before, in the women of his mother's village. He said nothing, just watched her with a new, terrifying intensity. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she stopped her reading lesson and placed her hand over her flat stomach. Her eyes met his across the flames. "James," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I believe I am with child." The words fell into the silence of the cabin and seemed to suck all the air from it. He stared at her, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. A child, a son or a daughter. A life that would be a part of him and a part of her. It was a hope so fierce and terrifying it threatened to break him. He had spent his life running from attachments, from anything that could be taken from him. Now, in this hidden valley, he had a wife, a home, and a future growing inside the woman he loved. He had everything to lose. He stood, walked over to her, and knelt, placing his calloused hand gently over hers on her belly. He did not speak. He did not need to. In that simple, reverent gesture, he accepted it all. The hope, the fear, the responsibility. This was his family. This was his tribe. The first heavy snow fell the day he finished the fireplace. They watched the flakes drift down, thick and silent, from the safety of their solid walls. The warmth of the first real fire on their faces. The cabin was small, just a single room, but it was theirs. It was a fortress of their own making. He took his knife and, on the large, flat stone that formed the cornerstone of the hearth, he carefully carved 2 letters, W, H. It was not just a name, it was a claim. This is the home of the White Horse family. We are here. We will endure. But the world outside their valley had not forgotten them. The signs were small at first. So small he almost dismissed them as tricks of the light, products of a mind stretched taut with vigilance. One afternoon, while checking his perimeter, he found a small pile of ash from a cold campfire a mile from the pass, half hidden under a rocky overhang. The wood that had been burned was willow, a species that did not grow in their high valley. It was a small, discordant note in the symphony of the wilderness. A week later, the sign was undeniable. He went to check on their horse, which was grazing in the meadow. The leather rein he had left looped over a branch was cut. It was not frayed, not chewed by a curious animal. It was a clean, straight slice, made by a sharp knife. It was a message, a quiet, brutal statement of presence. We can get this close. We can touch what is yours. We are watching. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt like a lie. The peace of the valley was a thin veneer over awaiting violence. James did not tell Evelyn about the rain. He did not want to put the shadow of fear in her eyes. But a new, colder urgency drove him. He began to reinforce the cabin door, to build a low stone wall that would provide cover between the cabin and the tree line. He spent his days hunting, smoking meat on the new rack he had built, filling their small root cellar with a store of food. And in the evenings, by the fire, he began another project. He had found a piece of clear, straight-grained aspen, and with his small, sharp knife, he began to carve. He worked slowly, the shavings falling to the floor like dry leaves. He was not carving a hawk or a bear. He was carving the curved rockers and the high, protective sides of a cradle. It was an act of desperate, defiant hope, a promise to the unborn child that this place, this small cabin in a hidden valley, would be a safe harbor. The unseasonal cold snap that had driven them to finish the cabin lingered, a persistent, biting chill that kept the snow on the ground and the stream fringed with ice. The days grew shorter, the nights longer. Their world shrank to the warm circle of the firelight, the sturdy walls of their home. It was a quiet, domestic time, filled with the small rhythms of survival and preparation. It could have been peaceful, but the knowledge of the cut rain, of the strange campfire ash, was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their lives. He felt like a man living on the slope of a sleeping volcano. One evening, as the last of the light bled from the sky, they were sitting inside, the cradle nearly finished beside the hearth. Evelyn was sewing a small garment from a piece of soft deerskin. James was cleaning his rifle. The world was utterly still, muffled by a fresh blanket of snow. And then they heard it, a single, sharp crack that split the silence. It was distant, from over the north ridge. The sound flattened and absorbed by the snow and the trees, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a rifle shot. James froze, his hands still on his own weapon. He and Evelyn looked at each other, their eyes wide in the flickering firelight. The peace was shattered. The volcano was waking up. The rifle shot echoed in James's memory long after the sound had faded. It was a declaration of war. And in the days that followed, the hidden valley transformed from a sanctuary into a cage. The peace they had built was a fragile illusion. And now, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footfall. He worked with a feverish intensity, his movement stripped of all but the most essential purpose. He was no longer building a home. He was fortifying a position. He spent the daylight hours setting traps, not for game, but for men. He dug a shallow pit filled with sharpened stakes along the most likely approach to the cabin, covering it with a flimsy lattice of branches and a dusting of snow. He set tripwires connected to heavy logs, and in the dense woods near the stream, he fashioned a brutal snare, a variation on a Comanche design meant to catch not an ankle, but a wrist, and hold a man fast. He was turning their small paradise into a weapon, and the work made his heart grow cold and hard. Evelyn watched him, her face pale, but her expression resolute. She did not speak of the coming danger, but she moved with a quiet purpose of her own, stockpiling firewood inside the cabin, checking their dwindling supply of salt and flour, mending their clothes. The cradle he had been carving sat unfinished by the hearth, a silent testament to a future that felt increasingly remote. The hope it represented was a fragile flame in a rising wind. They slept in shifts, one always awake by the fire, a rifle across their lap. The silence of the long, dark nights was a torment, a canvas onto which the mind painted every possible horror. James felt the walls of his own making closing in on him. He had brought her here to protect her, but he had only led the wolves to her door. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in his chest. The attack came in the gray hour before dawn, the time of deepest cold and lowest spirits. There was no warning, no shouted demand, just the sudden, violent explosion of the cabin's single window as a bullet tore through the stretched hide covering. Splinters of wood and ice showered the room. James was already moving, rolling from his position by the fire, grabbing Evelyn and shoving her toward the trapdoor to the small root cellar he had dug beneath the floorboards. "Go!" he hissed. "Do not come out! No matter what you hear, do not come out!" Her eyes were wide with terror in the flickering firelight, but she did not hesitate. She scrambled into the dark earthen space, pulling the heavy wooden door down after her. A second later, another bullet ripped through the cabin wall, thudding into the log where her head had just been. He crawled to the wall, his rifle in his hand. He peered through a small chinking gap he had prepared for this very purpose. He could see them, 3 figures moving like ghosts in the pre-dawn gloom, dark shapes against the snow. These were not the men from Leadville. They were leaner, harder, moving with a predatory efficiency that spoke of long, bloody practice. A third shot, and then a fourth. They were trying to pin him down, to keep him from returning fire. Then he saw a flicker of movement, an arm arcing through the air. Something landed on the roof with a soft thump. A moment later, the smell of pitch and burning pine filled the cabin. A fire arrow, The roof, dried by the relentless cold, caught with a terrifying speed. An orange glow began to spread above him, and smoke began to snake down through the timbers. They were trying to burn him out. He had two choices: stay inside and suffocate, or go out and face their guns. He chose the guns. Kicking open the heavy plank door, he fired a single shot toward the nearest muzzle flash, then dove behind the low stone wall he had built. A bullet screamed past his head, chipping stone from the wall. Another tore a long, fiery line across his left forearm. He gasped as the pain, sharp and searing, shot through him. His arm went numb, his fingers refusing to obey his commands. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. He pressed himself against the frozen stones, his mind racing. He was pinned down, injured, and his home was burning behind him. A wave of black despair washed over him. He had failed. He had brought her to this, to die in a hole in the ground while he bled out in the snow. One of the attackers, seeing his return fire cease, grew bold. He broke from the cover of the trees, running low, a pistol in his hand, intending to flank the stone wall. He moved with a swift, confident stride, his eyes fixed on James's position. He did not see the thin, almost invisible tripwire stretched between two saplings. His boot caught. The man pitched forward with a curse, throwing his hands out to break his fall. His right hand plunged directly into the loop of the waiting snare. The mechanism triggered. A bent sapling, held under tremendous tension, sprang upright, yanking the man's arm viciously into the air. The braided leather loop, lined with sharpened bone fragments, tightened around his wrist like a jaw of teeth. The scream that tore from the man's throat was not human. It was the sound of an animal in mortal agony. It echoed through the silent valley, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. The other two attackers froze, their attention ripped from James to their ensnared companion, who was now dangling by one arm, his feet barely touching the ground, his body thrashing. The sight was so brutal, so unexpected, that it shattered their professional calm. It was the opening James needed. Gritting his teeth against the fire in his arm, he raised his rifle with his good hand, rested it on the wall, and took careful aim. He fired. The second bounty hunter spun around, clutching his leg, and fell into the snow with a cry of pain. The third man had seen enough. He fired one last wild shot in the direction of the cabin, then turned and began to retreat, dragging his wounded partner with him. "We will be back," he screamed, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and fear. "We will come back with enough men to burn this whole valley to the ground. You are dead men. You hear me, dead?" Then they were gone, swallowed by the trees, leaving behind only the sound of their comrades' desperate, agonized screams and the roar of the fire. James did not move until their footsteps had faded completely. He leaned his head against the cold stone of the wall, his body shaking with adrenaline and pain. The fire was raging now, the roof of the cabin a vortex of orange flame. He listened to the man in the trap, his screams slowly weakening into whimpers and pleas. He felt nothing, no pity, no remorse, only a vast, aching emptiness. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet. He walked over to the trapped man, who looked at him with wide, pain-glazed eyes. James raised his pistol, the movement stiff and awkward. The man's eyes widened further, a new terror replacing the pain. James fired a single, precise shot into the rope above the man's wrist. The man dropped to the ground in a heap, sobbing, clutching his mangled hand. "Get out of my valley," James said, his voice a dead monotone. "Tell your master this is not over." He turned his back and walked toward the burning ruin of his home. The roof was collapsing inward, sending a shower of sparks into the dawn sky. He kicked at the trapdoor. "Evelyn, it is safe." The door opened a crack, and she emerged, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with fear. She took in the scene, the burning cabin, the blood on his arm, the dark stain on the snow where the other man had fallen. She rushed to his side, her hands fluttering over his wounded arm. He pushed her away, not with anger, but with the weary finality of a defeated man. "It is my fault," he said, his voice raw with self-loathing. "I brought you here. I built this place. I thought I could protect you. I failed. My way has failed." He sank to his knees in the snow. The fight, the hope, the will to go on draining out of him. This was it, the end of the line, the all-is-lost moment, stark and cold as the Montana morning. Evelyn stared at him, at this strong, silent man brought to his knees by failure. She looked at the smoldering cabin, the symbol of their shared hope now just a pile of ash and blackened timbers. A cold fury, an emotion she had not felt since the day she decided to flee Howard Gaines, rose in her. Her fear was burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding steel. She was done being a victim. She was done being protected. She knelt in front of him, her hands gripping his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a power he had never heard before. "Your way has not failed. It has only ended. We tried hiding. We tried building walls. Now we fight. But not here, not like this." He stared at her blankly. "What are you talking about?" "The letter," she said, her eyes blazing. "The letter I brought from Colorado, the proof of what Gaines and his son are. We have hidden it long enough. Now we use it. It is a weapon. James. A better weapon than a rifle, if we use it correctly." "It is just a piece of paper," he said, his voice hollow. "Against a man like Gaines, it is nothing." "It is nothing if we are alone," she countered, her grip tightening. "But we are not alone. There are other people in this territory. Miners, ranchers, even some of your mother's people, who have been cheated and pushed aside by men like Gaines. They have no voice, but this letter, this proof, can be their voice, and ours." Her plan poured out of her, not as a desperate hope, but as a clear, logical strategy. They would go to the nearest town, a place called Fort Shaw. They would find the law, a federal marshal, anyone who would listen. They would make the contents of the letter public. They would use it to rally support, to show the world what kind of man Howard Gaines truly was. "It is a fool's errand," he said, shaking his head. "They will not listen to a half-breed and a runaway woman. They will listen to Gaines's money. Then we make them listen." She insisted. "We cannot win his war, James. We cannot outshoot his hired guns forever. But we can fight a different war, a war of truth. Courage is not the absence of fear, my love. It is a habit. We have been brave in our hiding. Now we must be brave in our standing." He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time since the attack. She was not the frightened woman he had pulled from his snare. She was not the quiet partner who had helped him build a home. She was a leader, a warrior in her own right. He looked at his bleeding arm, a symbol of his own failed strength. He looked at her belly, where their child grew, a symbol of a future that demanded more than he alone could give. He had always believed that relying on others was a weakness. He saw now that it was the only strength they had left. She took a strip of cloth from her cloak and began to clean his wound, her movements gentle but efficient. He winced, but did not pull away. As she wrapped the bandage around his arm, her hands over his, it felt like a vow, a new pact. "A storm is coming," he said, looking at the heavy gray clouds gathering over the peaks. "A big one." "Good," she said, tying the final knot. "It will cover our tracks." He got to his feet, his body aching, his heart heavy, but the black despair was gone, replaced by a flicker of her own fierce resolve. He looked at the ruin of their home, at the unfinished cradle lying in the snow. It was not an ending. It was a cleansing, a trial by fire that had burned away their old life, leaving only what was essential: each other. They salvaged what little they could: a blanket, a rifle, the last of their food, and the small leather satchel containing Howard Gaines's secrets. As the first flakes of the new storm began to fall, they turned their backs on the smoking valley and started the long climb down the mountain, leaving the dead and the dying behind them. They were not running anymore. They were marching to war. Fort Shaw was a town built on order, a stark contrast to the raw chaos of Leadville. Its streets were wide, laid out in a grid, and the presence of the nearby military post gave it an air of discipline that the mining camps lacked. But beneath the surface, it was still the frontier, a place where justice was often a matter of who had the faster gun or the deeper pockets. James and Evelyn arrived under the cover of the blizzard, two exhausted figures melting out of the white curtain of the storm, their faces grim, their purpose a hard, cold knot in their bellies. They took a modest room in a boarding house and spent the first day in a state of watchful waiting, gathering their strength, listening to the rhythms of the town. James, his arm still bandaged and stiff, scouted the layout, noting the location of the United States Marshal's office, the telegraph station, and the main crossroads. Evelyn, meanwhile, transcribed the most damning pages of Howard Gaines's ledger onto clean paper, her handwriting clear and precise, a testament to the education her captor had so foolishly provided. On the second day, they made their move. They walked to the marshal's office, a solid log building with a single barred window. The marshal himself was a grizzled veteran with a weary expression, a man who had seen too much trouble to be easily impressed. He listened to their story with a non-committal skepticism, his eyes lingering on James's Comanche features and Evelyn's torn cloak, a runaway ward and a half-breed husband. It was a story that could go 100 different ways, most of them bad. It was as he was examining the ledger that the door to his office burst open. The bounty hunter who had escaped their valley stood there, his face a mask of triumphant malice. Behind him were 4 other men, their hands resting on their pistols, their eyes cold and empty. "There she is, Marshal," the bounty hunter said, a sneer in his voice. "Just like I told you, Evelyn Ashmore, a runaway ward. I have a legal claim for her return, signed by her guardian, Mr. Howard Gaines himself. We will be taking her now." The marshal looked from the bounty hunters to James and Evelyn, his hand moving slowly toward the butt of his own pistol. The small office was suddenly a powder keg, the air thick with the promise of violence. "That will not be necessary." The voice came from the doorway. All heads turned. Standing there, his black suit dusted with snow, was Judge Morrison. He had arrived in Fort Shaw the day before on a circuit court tour, a traveling pillar of the very law these men were trying to subvert. His eyes took in the scene, his gaze sharp and missing nothing. He looked at James and Evelyn, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitehorse," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It seems trouble has a way of finding you." He then turned his stern gaze on the bounty hunters. "I seem to recall settling this matter in Leadville. This woman is a legally married wife. Your guardianship claim is null and void." The lead bounty hunter laughed, a short, ugly sound. "That piece of paper you signed means nothing out here. We have a new warrant for his arrest." He pointed a gloved finger at James. "For assault and kidnapping." It was a clever move, a legal maneuver designed to separate them, to leave Evelyn unprotected. The marshal's face hardened. He was a man of the law, and a warrant was a warrant, no matter how dubious its origins. "This has gone on long enough," Evelyn said, her voice, clear and strong, cut through the tension. She stepped forward, no longer hiding behind James, but standing beside him. "Marshal Judge Morrison, this is not a family matter. It is a criminal one, and the criminal is not my husband. It is Howard Gaines." She laid the pages she had copied on the marshal's desk, alongside the original letter. "My former guardian is not just a concerned benefactor. He is involved in the fraudulent acquisition of land and mining claims, and he uses the guise of guardianship to control and traffic young women for his own purposes. This letter, from his son, details one such transaction. This ledger documents the payments." Judge Morrison picked up the letter. He began to read it aloud. his voice ringing with a cold, clear authority. The contents were sordid. A casual discussion of a young woman being traded to a business associate in exchange for a favorable contract. A small crowd had gathered outside the marshal's office, drawn by the confrontation. As the judge's voice carried into the street, a murmur went through the onlookers.
"It is all lies,"
the bounty hunter snarled, his composure beginning to crack. "Fabrications from a hysterical woman and a wanted man." "Is it a new voice called from the crowd?" A wiry miner, his face permanently stained with coal dust, pushed his way forward. "I recognize that name. Gaines's railroad company bought my claim near Helena for 10 cents on the dollar. Told me it was worthless. Then a month later they struck a silver vein big enough to choke a mule. And my horse ranch," another man added. A stocky man with the powerful hands of a horseman. "Gaines's men ran 24 of my best mares off a cliff to get me to sell him the grazing rights to my land, said it was a wolf pack." 2 Comanche men, who had been standing silently at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. James met their gaze and spoke a few words in the language of his mother. One of the warriors, a man with a face like a carved piece of mahogany, turned to the crowd and spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "The man of the Iron Road," he said, gesturing toward the papers in the judge's hand. "He broke the treaty. He took the land of the winter camp. He promised payment that never came. He is a man with a forked tongue." A circuit preacher, his Bible clutched in his hand, raised his voice. "I have buried girls who worked in his company camps, girls who came west for a new life and found only despair. What this woman says is the truth. I have seen the face of this evil." The bounty hunter saw the tide turning, the weight of public opinion swinging against him like a saloon door. He saw the law, the people, all of it slipping from his grasp. His face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men. It was the signal James had been waiting for. As the bounty hunter's hands dropped to their guns, James moved. He was not the desperate survivor of the valley. He was a calm, cold commander. He shoved Evelyn behind the solid oak of the marshal's desk, drew his own pistol, and fired in a single, fluid motion. His first shot took one of the bounty hunters in the shoulder, spinning him around. The street erupted into a cacophony of gunfire, screams, and shouting. The marshal, reacting instantly, fired his shotgun over the heads of the crowd, the blast momentarily stunning the attackers. The horse rancher pulled a pistol from his coat and fired at the man closest to him. It was chaos, a maelstrom of sudden, brutal violence. The lead bounty hunter, his legal strategy in ruins, saw only one prize left. He lunged for Evelyn, trying to use the chaos to drag her away. James met him head-on. It was not a gunfight, but a desperate, physical struggle. They crashed against the wall of the office, the bounty hunter's knife flashing in the gray light. James, his bandaged arm screaming in protest, caught the man's wrist. Twisting it with all his strength, the knife clattered to the boardwalk. He drove his fist into the man's jaw. A single, decisive blow that sent him sprawling into the street, dazed and bleeding. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. One of the bounty hunters lay dead in the street, his gun still in his hand. 2 were wounded, and the leader was being hauled to his feet by the marshal and the enraged miner. The threat, the physical, violent arm of Howard Gaines's will, was broken. The silence that fell was profound. The crowd stood in stunned stillness. Then, from the small church at the end of the street, a bell began to ring, its clear, steady tone calling the faithful to evening prayer. But to James and Evelyn, it was a sound of liberation, a public proclamation of their victory. Judge Morrison, his face grim but his eyes alight with a fierce satisfaction, stood on the steps of the marshal's office. He held up the letter. "By the authority vested in me by the laws of the United States and the territory of Montana," he announced, his voice carrying over the silent crowd, "I am issuing a temporary order of protection for Mrs. Evelyn Whitehorse. Any man who attempts to harm or apprehend her will be charged with a federal crime. He turned to the marshal. "You will take this man," he said, pointing to the captured bounty hunter, "and this evidence to the territorial capital in Helena. From there, it will be sent to the federal prosecutor in Denver. It seems Mr. Howard Gaines has some questions to answer." It was over. The combined power of the law and the community had stood against the power of money and had won. James walked over to Evelyn, who was now standing, her face pale but her eyes shining with a fierce, triumphant light. He looked at the men who had stood with them, the miner, the rancher, the preacher, his Comanche brothers. He had won, not with his own strength alone, but with the strength of others. He had learned the lesson Evelyn had tried to teach him. He was not alone. He took her hand, his grip firm and steady. The church bell continued to toll, its sound washing over the town, cleansing the air of the scent of gunpowder and fear. The storm had passed. The war was not over, but this battle was won. They were free. He looked north, toward the distant, snow-covered peaks that hid their valley. The road home was open. The return to the valley was a quiet pilgrimage. The blizzard that had covered their escape had also blanketed the land in a profound and cleansing silence. They traveled not as fugitives, but as homesteaders returning to their claim. When they reached the pass and looked down into their hidden world, the sight was one of both ruin and promise. The snow had softened the harsh lines of the burned cabin, draping a white mantle over the blackened timbers. The valley was not a grave. It was a fallow field, waiting for a new season. They did not speak of the fire or the fight. The past was a landscape they had already crossed. Their focus was on the work ahead. They spent the first days living in the supply cave, a temporary shelter against the lingering winter chill. The first task was to salvage. They sifted through the ashes of their home, finding what had endured the flames, a cast-iron pot, warped but usable, the charred handles of a few tools, the heavy stones of the hearth, scorched but solid. The foundation remained. That was all they needed. The rebuilding began not with a sense of frantic urgency, as their first construction had, but with a deep, patient deliberation. This was not a shelter thrown up against a storm. It was a home being raised in the quiet promise of peace. James, with the help of the rancher from Fort Shaw, who rode out to check on them, felled new trees, his axe swinging with a steady, powerful rhythm. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a builder, a man creating a future with his own two hands. Evelyn directed the work with a quiet confidence. She had a vision for their home that went beyond mere shelter. They did not just replace the roof, they raised the pitch, allowing for a small sleeping loft. They added a second window, this one facing east to catch the morning sun, and on the south side, facing the meadow. They built a porch, a wide deck of hewn planks where they could sit and watch the seasons change. It was a defiant act of permanence, a statement that they were here to stay, to live, not just to hide. As the last of the snows melted, turning the valley floor into a tapestry of green and gold, they began to plant. James broke the sod with their sturdy horse, carving long, straight furrows in the dark, rich earth. Evelyn followed behind, dropping seed potatoes and kernels of corn into the ground, her hands pressing them into the soil with a gentle, hopeful touch. They were planting roots, both literally and figuratively. They were entrusting their future to the good earth of this valley. The news from the outside world came in late spring, carried by a traveling mail rider, a new and welcome link to the community that had stood with them. The letter, bearing Judge Morrison's frank, was from the United States Marshal's office in Denver. It was short and to the point. Howard Gaines was under federal investigation. His assets had been frozen. His vast network of influence was unraveling, and his son had fled the country. The warrants for his hired guns were being executed across the territory. The reign of the man with the forked tongue was over. Evelyn read the letter aloud as they sat on their new porch in the warm evening air. James listened, his expression unreadable. He felt no triumph, no elation, only a quiet, profound relief, the feeling of a great weight being lifted from his soul. The war was over. The ghosts were finally laid to rest. He looked out at the neat rows of their emerging crops, at the solid log walls of their home, at the woman sitting beside him, her hand resting on her swollen belly. This was his victory. Not the fall of a distant enemy, but the rise of this small, precious world. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn undertook a project of her own. With paper and ink purchased on a supply run, she sat on the porch and wrote letters. She wrote to Judge Morrison, her words a formal but heartfelt expression of gratitude for his unwavering belief in the law. She wrote to the miner and the rancher, thanking them for their courage. She even sent a letter to the circuit preacher, enclosing a small donation for his church, a tithe paid from the bounty of their new life. It was her way of weaving the threads of their solitary existence back into the larger fabric of the world, a recognition that their freedom had been a community effort. As the summer sun warmed the valley, it became clear that the baby would arrive with the turning of the leaves. There was a midwife, an old, wise woman named Martha Gable, who lived on a small homestead 2 days' ride to the south. James made the journey to speak with her, a journey not of escape, but of preparation. He returned with her promise to come when she was summoned. The call came on a crisp morning in late September, when the aspens on the high slopes were turning a brilliant, fiery gold. Evelyn's labor began, and James rode like the wind, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He returned with the midwife, a calm, steady presence in the face of life's great and terrifying mystery. Sarah Whitehorse was born as the sun was setting. Her first cry, a thin, reedy sound that filled the small cabin with a miracle. She was tiny and perfect, with a shock of black hair and Evelyn's clear, determined eyes. Martha Gable, her work done, cleaned and swaddled the baby and placed her in James's arms. He had held many things in his life, a rifle, an axe, the reins of a horse, but he had never held anything so fragile and so powerful. He looked down at the small, sleeping face, at the tiny, perfect hands, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled into dust. He had spent his life searching for a place to belong, a tribe to call his own. He had thought it was a piece of land, a hidden valley. He realized now it was not a place at all. It was this small, warm weight in his arms. This was his home. This was his people. Life settled into a new and beautiful rhythm, dictated by the needs of a child and the turning of the seasons. The days were filled with the quiet, satisfying labor of a homestead. They built a small stable for the horse, harvested their potatoes and corn, and stockpiled wood for the coming winter. The valley that had once been a fortress was now a cradle, a safe and nurturing world for their daughter. One afternoon, as the first chill of autumn was in the air, James took his knife and stood before the main beam of the porch roof. Evelyn came out to watch him, holding Sarah in her arms. He worked slowly, the blade of his knife cutting deep into the seasoned pine. He was not carving a hawk or a bear. He was carving words, the foundational text of their new life, the only law that truly mattered. We chose each other. That is our law. He stepped back and looked at his work. The letters were rough-hewn, but the meaning was as clear and solid as the mountain at their back. He looked at Evelyn, at the daughter in her arms, at the home they had built from the ashes. His life of solitude was a distant memory, a story from another lifetime. The future was here, on this porch, in this valley, in the faces of his family. The world outside would continue to turn, bringing with it new seasons, new challenges, perhaps new neighbors or the hardship of a dry year. But here, within the circle of this chosen family, they were free. They were home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.